I'm Sue Anstis and welcome to the Game Changers podcast, where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport. A huge thank you to our new partner Sport England, who are kindly supporting the next 3 series of the Game Changers podcast through the National Lottery. My guest today is Wafula Strike. Anne is an extraordinary para-athlete who is also an author, inspirational speaker, disability rights campaigner and a powerful advocate for the less fortunate in society, passionate about equality and the right of disabled people to be heard. So Anne, I was so moved and inspired by your book, In My Dreams I Dance. Can you tell us a little about your childhood in Kenya and how things changed for you as a young girl?
Oh, thank you so much, Sue, for asking me to be your guest on today's show. Yeah, that is a very broad question. I feel like I spend so much time in Africa, sort of maybe crawling on my hands and knees or hobbling on calipers and crutches, suffering the exclusion and the prejudice and the stigma that came with the fact that I was a disabled woman. I was born as a very normal, healthy child with no disability. And in fact, what my parents say to me is that I was the easy one to be brought out of this world, meaning that my mother had a very sort of like easy childbirth. And then at about 2.5 years, I was struck down by an illness that no one knew what it was in a village in a western part of Kenya. Definitely, when your child is ill, and there's no science that you can put to it, you want to find reasons and you want to find cures to help your child. So the villagers had different perceptions of what had sort of like made me ill. And some thought, oh, she's just been cast. Others were like, no, you know what? This is witchcraft. And this was all because of a lack of knowledge of what was really ailing me. And it was until when my father took me to the capital city of Kenya, which is Nairobi. Then the doctors say to my dad, oh, Mr. Wafula, your daughter actually contracted something or a disease called poliomyelitis. So that was me. And when I found myself in that state of not being able to walk, first of all, when polio hit me, I couldn't use even my hands. I forgot how to speak. I couldn't say mama. I was dribbling again. I went back to being like a baby. And that was quite traumatic for my parents, because they just did not have all the answers until when they were told that I had polio. So as soon as they knew what it was, then they took me to a school for the physically handicapped, and I had rehabilitation, and I sort of actually started to get an education.
And how did the village and the community respond at the time that you contracted polio?
Oh, do you know, I think to them, polio wasn't in their vocabulary. They did not understand what that was. Actually, one thing I haven't said is we did not just leave the village. We were ostracized. We were actually thrown out of the village. Here I was disabled. The community around me did not understand what it was. They were so fearful that, their children or other people in the village could contract the same thing. Or if it was the curse would be contagious. So they wanted me either dead or just get out of the village. On 3 occasions, they tried to burn my dad's hut down, and we had to flee from the village.
And you lost your mother when you were just 9. I can only imagine how terrible that must have been. But what do you think gave you the strength to overcome those challenges that you faced at such a young age, Anne?
When my mom was still alive, she was my world. My mom did everything. She bathed me. She fetched water for me. She cooked for me. She made my hair. I was her little princess. She used to call me my rose. Come here, my rose, my beautiful daughter. She was my world. And for my mom to die and leave me like that with no motherly love, that had a huge impact on me. The first few years, I was just surviving. I think I was just numb for so many years. Thank goodness I had a father who still loved me unconditionally. And I had a father, I had this man who knew that he needed to protect me. He needed to open the world up for me. And he knew that if he didn't do that, then I would be just sort of, my life would be shrinking and shrinking. And, I would just sort of like disappear completely.
And despite those enormous challenges and the attitudes of society, you attended school, you went on to university and qualified as a teacher. So how easy was it to access education as a disabled person in Kenya?
Oh, that was a huge challenge. That was a huge challenge. Because, you talk of access, you talk of, having toilets that you can use, as a disabled person. You talk of maybe walking from A to B. That was huge. I did not have the luxury of a wheelchair earlier on. So I had to really hobble on my calipers and crutches just to move for 50 meters. That would sort of take me more than 20 minutes or something like that. So that was my life. And I went back home and I said to my dad, I said, Dad, I don't want to go back. I do not want to go back to school. I struggled to walk around the compound, walking from the dormitory to the classrooms. I keep falling on my face, and I have to rely on friends to go and get water for me, to go and collect food from the dining hall. And my dad said, Anne, I remember, I'm so blessed that he is my father, actually. He said, Anne, there's nothing wrong with your head. He said, yes, you're struggling with your body because of this disability, but there's nothing that can prevent you from getting an education. He said, look at education like a key. And what I'm trying to do when I'm trying to push you and sort of urge you to get an education, I'm actually giving you a magic key.
Love that.
And this is a key that you will sort of use this magic key to open up so many doors in the world. Use your brain, get an education. And that is how I learned to embrace education. But having said that, Sue, for so many years, actually, I lived a life of struggle, as a disabled person, because I couldn't do the things that, people around me were doing. I struggled with self-esteem. I really struggled with so many issues where I needed to sort of like accept that I'm never ever going to walk upright like my siblings or my cousins or my friends. I needed to accept that first. When I accepted my fate, I want to call it fate in quotes, that yes, I am disabled, I've got thin legs, and that is just how it's going to be. But then how do I turn this negative into a positive?
Your father sounds like a fantastic man as well. He must have been, and all your family, so proud of all you achieved. You went on to teach. What was it that you loved about teaching?
What I loved about teaching was actually just seeing these young people and knowing that I was sort of like I was a vessel, or I was an instrument that was impacting knowledge, in their lives. Teachers are very important people, and I just I thrived as a person. When I would be in front of a classroom teaching, and my students will ask me questions, and marking their books, reading and seeing what they'd written, and I even went further to start sort of counseling and supporting them. Some of them were having really serious challenges. And then this was also just the height of when women were starting to sort of realize that they can also be just equal members of a society or a community. So I started to challenge my female students to step up. You need to show the world that you are capable. There was no point of me being a woman with a disability, so to say, and sort of just sitting there and accepting that, or just because we are women, so we need to sort of like calculate our steps, or we need to be slow and, to catch up or anything like that. No, I always used to say, because you are a woman, you really need to fight harder. You need to put in more effort, because that is also the time when women in Kenya were being paid a less wage than men in some professions. So I needed to start educating my female students that these are some of the barriers that you will meet when you finish from here, when you go and start looking for employment.
You went on, obviously, to become an incredible Paralympian, and I am going to come on to that in a moment. But did you have access to physical education at all at school or at university when you were growing up?
Oh, when I was growing up in a primary education, we used to have, a bit of physical education where they would take us into this big hall, and you'd be sat down, you throw bean bags, you throw your softballs to one another, you breathe in and out, you stretch, and that was it. And I went to secondary school, and there was more activities, but I wasn't involved because I was that disabled girl sitting on the sideline cheering on my peers while they were running 100 meters, 1500 meters, or playing hockey, or playing all those things. I wasn't included. I was on the sideline holding their books, holding their jumpers and their water. But this is because they just did not know what to do with me. They just had no idea. I found other ways to keep myself busy. So I would go to the chapel and play the piano, and actually I taught myself to play by ear, which is another skill that I never really talk about.
Do you still play today?
I do. I play. I play, and it's really funny. You won't believe that when I was back in Kenya, I actually played on so many records.
Oh wow!
I was sort of like asked to go in as a session player, and sometimes I listen to some of the music that I played, and I'm like, oh, I should have continued, playing music. But the funny thing also, so is that when I was coming to this country, one of the things that was on the list was to meet the late Ian Dury. Ian Dury was a polio survivor, musician.
Oh, he was, yeah.
Yes, and the plan was to meet Ian Dury, and then do a duet with Ian Dury, raise funds and support the polio survivors back in Kenya. But unfortunately, Ian Dury actually died on the day that I arrived.
Oh wow! He's amazing. He was an amazing musician, wasn't he?
Oh, amazing, because I love music, and I never used to see so many disabled musicians. But Ian Dury was the kind of person who was like, wow, he's doing it. So he was that kind of person who was a big inspiration.
Yeah, and such a social activist as well, wasn't he? I mean, driving such change too. Oh, that's fascinating. We could have a whole other podcast talking to you about music, couldn't we?
Yeah.
It was fascinating to read how it was only really at university that you realised other countries had more disabled role models. Do you remember who you saw or where you became more aware of that?
Oh, seeing role models when I was growing up as a young girl was zero. Was completely zero. And my first teaching job was at a school, college in the northern and northeastern part of Kenya. And the principal was a polio survivor. And I went to greet him with my right hand, and he sort of like, he extended his left one, and he said, oh, this one was withered by polio. I was like, what? I was like, sir, you are a polio survivor. And he said, yes, I'm a polio survivor. Then I said, I'm also a polio survivor. And we started exchanging talks about polio and how it had affected us, and about vaccines. And, we went into that philosophical debate of why vaccines are so important to young kids, especially those ones who were born in the rural areas, and but then it just sort of struck me that this guy having a withered arm, that did not really stop him. And he's actually narrated to me how when he was going to school when he was very young, he was being forced to write with the right hand.
Oh, wow.
But he couldn't because that is the hand that was withered. So he had to learn to write using his left hand. But they constantly used to cane him because they just believed you needed to use your right hand, It was really, really comforting to know that people like myself are actually excelling and doing things. If you ask me whether I used to see disabled people on TV and stuff like that, when I was growing up in Kenya, no. So, to sort of like know that I was growing without a role model, and there are things that as a human being, I would dream and I would be like, oh, this is what I want to be. This is what I want to be. I want to achieve this. I want to do that. It was almost impossible because without the visibility of people who looked like myself, I started to think maybe it will never happen because I don't see people like myself around, but when I would go travel, I would see people like myself in the streets begging. I would see people like myself in the streets being laughed at, being spat at. And to me, that horrified me. And I think, I kind of think that maybe that's why I don't want to say that I get angry, but I get frustrated when, a nation that has got the opportunity to really make meaningful inclusion and access to people with disabilities fail to do that. It frustrates me.
I was going to ask you a little about that. Around London 2012, actually, it seemed to promise a real turning point in attitudes to disabled people in Great Britain. And we remember the Meet the Superhumans campaign and posters and so on. Do you think it did have a big impact for the nation?
Do you know, London 2012 was magical, And if you speak to any athlete who competed at London 2012, they'll tell you how important that was and how it sort of like just changed how people looked at disability. But it was only in one angle. And what I want to say is that if you are an athlete, then people started to look at you as an elite athlete. Not just those disabled people trying to do amazing things, trying to run 100 meters or trying to do the marathon, To be honest, when you have such games, household names are created, which is very important. The only challenge that we saw after the games in 2012 was the world expecting every disabled person to get out, get in a racing chair, get a prosthetic leg, go swimming, do everything. And that was so unfair because, it's not every able-bodied person that becomes a Usain Bolt or is a Mo Farah. But also, it's sort of like, it sort of just showed the community that when you have a disability, really, if you're given an opportunity, you can excel. And I think to me, that was my big take from the games in 2012, the London 2012, the Paralympic Games. I think it was more of opportunity, access, inclusion, support. It was just sort of like really incredible to see so many disabled athletes on TV, on posters, and people were talking and calling them by their names because they knew who they were. That was beautiful.
It was indeed. And it was the year 2000, you moved to the UK and had a baby, Tim. And what was your experience like as coming to the UK as a Black disabled woman?
Oh, do you know, when I was in, this is what, it's really interesting. Thanks for asking that question. When I was in Africa, I fought two prejudices where I was a woman and I had a disability. So these were the two things that I was fighting. And when I came to the UK, I thought those were the things that I'll be fighting. But then moving here, I was like, it was just incredible to see disabled people being empowered in the way that they did. But I think what I was not prepared for was the fact that I would have to sort of like start being reminded that I was a Black woman. And that threw me off balance a little bit. I have experienced this in so many subtle ways. And I think sometimes those are more disturbing and more pinching than when somebody just called you the name. Because when someone calls you the name, you know exactly where you stand with them. And you know what to do about that. But when they are subtle, you don't know how to ask for support because you know somebody will say to you, what evidence do you have? And I think you know what I'm trying to talk about is racism. And I think this is something that really it should never be tolerated, because so instead of fighting the fact that I am a woman, or instead of fighting the fact that I'm a disabled person, you know, I had another third cross that I had to start carrying around. Sometimes it wears you down. It really wears you down. And it's a shame that you have to spend some kind of energy trying to sort these things out.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very true, isn't it? I always think it's almost a bit like the paper cuts, isn't it, in terms of the pain that those things cause, almost like an insidious below the level.
No, you are so right. You know, you are so right. And sometimes when you look at that cut, it's such a thin line, yet so painful. You know, that is how subtle racism is, really. And really, this is something that should never be tolerated in society. And sometimes when you speak to people, people say, "Oh, I'm not racist," you know. And I'm like, it's not just enough to be non-racist. We should be anti-racist. That is what we should be. And we are seeing this, you know, this devil growing horns in different sports, and people being called names because they have a different color or they speak differently. And these are things that really we should not tolerate them in society.
I want to come and talk a little bit more about board roles, but I'm just going to take you back to, I guess, your journey to Paralympian and becoming a Paralympian. So from coming here and having your baby, what was that journey to then ending up as an extraordinary athlete?
Oh, I never knew that I would actually play sport. So I still really remember after I had my child, and I would look at myself and I was like, no, this is not the Anne I knew. Where are my cheekbones? They disappeared because now I have a round face, you know. And I also realized that wheeling myself around, I was starting to tire quite quickly. So I went to the gym to lose a bit of weight, just to get fit so that I could be more active mom in a wheelchair and, you know, stuff like that. And there was one of the running coaches who was training in the gym, and he sort of saw what I was doing, and he was like, "Do you know you could actually do disabled sport?" And I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" But it was after a few days. I remember I was sitting in my living room, going through, just, you know, flickering through the TV channels, and I was just changing and changing. And then my eye caught these amazing women in racing wheelchairs. This was the Commonwealth 2002 in Manchester. And I tell you what, Sue, I was just, my eyes were fixated on, you know, on the TV screen, and I was like, wow, I want to do this. And one person who really caught my eye was a lady from Australia. Her name is Louise Savage. Louise had the same build as me, and I was like, look at her. And, you know, I was sort of just looking straight at the screen, and Louise was in front of the pack, pushing and, you know, with determination, pumping those push rims. And the camera just focused on her eyes, her face. And that was a beautiful image to see. And I was like, I would like to try this. And after a few months, the community bought my first racing wheelchair.
And what did that feel like to be in that for the first time in a racing chair?
To be honest, so this was amazing. And the more I trained, I started to go past able-bodied, athletes on the track. And this was just magic. They just don't know what used to happen in my soul when I went past them. This was it was so enriching. It was so empowering to me. And at that particular time, it wasn't about medals. I never bothered because that was not what I wanted. I wanted to have that opportunity to play sport. And now that I'd been given the chance, I'd been given the opportunity, and I'd been given the equipment, that was enough empowerment for me to enjoy this sport. And I did.
And you went on in 2004, you became the first wheelchair racer from sub-Saharan Africa to compete at the Paralympics in Athens. So what was that like to be then amongst other hugely respected Paralympic athletes?
Oh, that was exciting. That was exciting. Remember, this is a girl who was ostracized from the village. So, because I was different, because I'd become disabled and, good for nothing, to throw her out of the village. And then this is a girl that was now in Athens flying the flag of my nation. So how ironic was that? Wearing that jersey meant so much. It just meant so much because I knew so many people who did not believe that a disabled person could achieve something, especially, a disabled woman could achieve something like that. I knew they would be watching on TV. And yes, they watched me, So I remember when we went back to Kenya and many, people came and they were talking to me. And, what made me sad was the moms and some of the girls, the young women who were sort of like still just hanging out and crawling on the streets. And they were like, what do we do to be like you, Anne? What do we do to be like you? And the moms would say to me, what do we do so that we bring up our disabled girls to be like you? And I think that was a challenge. When we talk about people having voices, yes, everybody has a voice, but these parents and these young girls had voices, but they were so silent. They were not being heard, and that is where I felt like I could actually use this platform to amplify some of these voices.
You went on to compete for Paralympics GB, and I was really shocked to learn, and I had read this at the time, but almost reviewing you, but back in 2006, ahead of the World Championships, you were unfairly moved from the T53 category to a more able-bodied category, which had a massive impact on your medal chances at future championships. It must have been heartbreaking because you were obviously then deprived of the opportunity to compete fairly. You've said the reclassification haunts you every day. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there and how it impacted your sporting career?
First of all, let me start by saying that, classification is at the heart of parasport.
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to, when it comes to the elite level. In my case, things were not fair the way they should have been. Things were not done by the book the way they should have been. It is something that definitely was manipulated. And everyone knows that. It is public knowledge that, that it happened. And I think this impacted on me psychologically. But remember, I was an older athlete then. I wasn't like 16, 18, 20. I was in my 30s when this happened.
Yeah.
And it brought me down. I remember after I'd been reclassified in this new category that I'd been thrown into, my first ever race was 200 meters. I warmed up and I went to the call room the ladies that I'd been competing with for a very long time, who were in the other class, the class that I'd been taken out of. And they were like, and what are you doing there? You should be here. Why are you hanging out with the T54s? And I was like, this is my new class. And they were like, no way, no way. The coaches, like some classifiers from other nations were like, no, you can't, you cannot, you shouldn't be there and stuff like that. And I remember when I went out on the start line, I could not see I could not see the lines. I couldn't see. I couldn't see the markings on the track because my eyes were filled with tears. I just could not see. But to me, I was like, I am not going to cry. I'm not going to let this break me. I'm not going to let this break my spirit. And so, though I was now competing at a high level, I knew I would not be the best I can be in that category. It's like asking a lorry to have a race with a Bentley. It wasn't going to happen. And I was like, sport is not just about medals and world records. That is how I looked at it. And I said, when I came to this sport, I never knew about winning medals, and I never knew about classification, and I never knew about things, So I am going to go back to that first love that made me do this. And I stuck with that first love. And I know how that became something that helps me to heal every day about this. Because, to be honest, my career was cut short, because I was just coming to the peak of everything. Yeah. But that was taken away. And instead of me crying over spilled milk, I was like, again, how do we change this negative into a positive? And I think to me was how we now sort of like put good systems and processes in place so that other athletes who are competing at that high level are not disadvantaged. Because now we are talking about medals, we are talking about money, we are talking about sponsorship, we are talking about all these good, shiny things that come with winning, And I think it will be wrong if, something like that continued to happen. It will be wrong. But, the funny thing is, classification is a system that is continuously evolving. It is something that will continue to evolve because there's new disabilities coming, there's new challenges, and also with technology, you sort of realize that maybe people in certain classes will start to perform better despite their disability, and people will question their disability because of what they're doing. So this is an area where I think, to me, maybe my call will be to the IPC to invest a lot of money into this area, just to make sure that there is exactly proper systems in place. And if there's any gray areas that is still there, that needs to be looked into.
Have you ever had any apology or compensation for what happened to you?
Yeah, I've never had an apology. So that is a very good question. I've never had an apology to what happened to me. But then, do I need an apology? And sometimes a public apology would be good. And then sometimes I'm like, maybe a good apology would be when nobody else suffers the way I did.
Yeah. Fabulous. Having read your book and heard you speak publicly and in this conversation today, I am struck by how you don't seem to ever appear a victim. You don't hold blame. You seem very forgiving of all that's happened in life, very compassionate. Where does that come from, do you think? Have you always felt that way?
Let me tell you something. When we were sort of ostracized from when we were chased away from the village, my father had so much bitterness. My father hated his village, hated everybody in that village because of what they'd done to us. They'd thrown his family out of his ancestral home. He hated them. And for so many years, my dad never wanted to return back in the village. He's now back in the village, living in a very nice house and, interacting and, doing so much work in the community. But it took my dad so many years before my dad sort of actually explained to us. And he said, do you know what? I forgive them. I forgive them because they did this out of ignorance. And I think my dad is my biggest role model when it comes to how I live life. He is the person who really, who sort of like, when I wake up sometimes, when you say, what have you done today to make you feel so proud? And I'm like, what have I done that my dad would be so happy, like, Anna's done this? Because I know he sacrificed so much to, for me to be where I am today. It wasn't easy for him to stand by me, to love me unconditionally when many other parents were disowning their disabled children.
I'm sure he rightly must be so incredibly proud of you today.
I think my dad needs to win Father of the Century or a decade or something like that.
You sit on the boards of UK Athletics and the British Paralympic Association, and it was widely reported a few years ago that you were the only black person on the boards of I think it was the top 12 major sports in the UK at the time. And that has changed since, but people from ethnically diverse backgrounds still only account for a small percentage of the board members across our sports organisations in the UK. So why do you feel, clearly I do agree, that that representation matters so much on sports boards?
I think representation of people from diverse communities do matter when it comes to sport and governance, because the people that you're serving need to see people that they can look up to and say, oh, I look like so and so, I speak like so and so. That is a hugely important, So when we talk about this representation, I think, to me, what I mean is representation should be within the governance, but also in high performance venues, national teams, membership, but more so on board levels, because they are the people who are charged or caretakers of sports. Our research has shown that the more diverse a board is, the better they seem to come up with the better solutions, and especially when it comes to putting strategies and delivering strategies. So we need to do that, because at the moment, even when this is changing, it's quite slow. When you look at athletes, especially at the elite level, you realize that we have so many people of Black origin winning medals for us, But then when you go higher up the pyramid, it starts to fade a little bit in color. And then when you get at the top, it's more white. There's hardly any Black people. There's also hardly many disabled people up there. And I think this is something that still needs to be talked about. I think organizations shouldn't sweep this under the carpet and sort of say that, oh, as long as we are plodding along, then that is okay. Or we are meeting our quotas for this, we are meeting our quotas for that. Where is the genuine appetite to bring change?
Absolutely. To be more ambitious.
They should be more ambitious, because otherwise it takes us back to ticking that box, because the governance policy is asking us for 3/4 or a quarter of this race or this type of people. We've had it, so let's tick that box. No, let's throw away the pens and let us be very ambitious within boardrooms.
Fantastic. And finally, Anne, you've clearly had an incredible life and made an enormous contribution to drive change for those less fortunate across society. But I'm intrigued to know what's next for you. What's next in your plans?
Oh, what is next on my plans? Do you know, at some point I thought, oh, should I go into politics? And I was like, could I be a good politician?
I'd vote for you.
Oh, would you? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sue. I think, to me, really, I'm so passionate to just see that inclusion is taken seriously. I honestly feel and believe that our responsibility as a developed nation, we really need to understand what this truly means and how this can be like very, very strong. I mean, so when we look at sport, sport is one of the most powerful vehicles, or it can be a strong catalyst to break barriers. It does. Sport has great benefits, to promote inclusion and to make people thrive. So we need sort of like to really go out and sort of start asking ourselves, how do we really want to champion sport as a catalyst for development in this nation and as a catalyst for inclusion, a catalyst for diversity in this nation? How do we do it? Because if we sort of don't ask ourselves that question, we'll just be going round and round the same thing, where we'll talk about exclusion, we'll talk about racism. So what are you doing about racism today? And then when it goes down, it's swept under the carpet. And then tomorrow, these horns are up again. But when we ask ourselves that question, when we know that inclusion should not be tolerance, but it should be unquestioned acceptance with no conditions, then we will start to address this thing.
I loved talking to Anne. What an incredible woman she is. Do visit fearlesswomen.co.uk where you can find out more about all of my guests from this and the previous 8 series. You can also listen to all the podcasts on the website and find out about the Women's Sport Collective, a free network for all women working in sport. You can sign up for Changing the Game, our weekly newsletter, which highlights the developments in global women's sport. And there's more about my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport, also available in all good bookshops. Thank you again to Sport England for backing the Game Changers through the National Lottery, and to Sam Walker, who's always brilliant in her role as executive producer of the podcast, along with Rory Auskery on sound production. Finally, a big thank you to my colleague at Fearless Women, Kate Hannon. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook at Sue Anstis. The Game Changers. Fearless Women in Sport.